I want to talk about the concept of what is money. And this really comes from my own perspective on the deep dive that I've done around money. And here's the thing, I wish as a kid this was taught to me. I wish this was taught in schools, but it's not. We're just almost, it's actually like we are fish in water, but we're so used to the water that we don't even know that it exists in the first place. We just take certain things for absolute granted. So this is actually a vital question, more vital than you would think, the question of what is money? Here's how I understand it. So the Austrian School of Economics has a beautiful definition. And of course, you can define these things a million different ways. But I really enjoyed this definition. There are multiple definitions, but this one was great. The School of Austrian Economics simply defines money as a universal medium of exchange. Fair enough to say? So, if you look at the history of mankind, we just take it for granted today that we use paper and we've got this magical thing called a credit card and internet banking. But that's actually not how the vast majority of time on Earth worked for human beings. So if you look at over the millennia, human beings have used some fascinating things as a universal medium of exchange. Things like shells, nails, cotton, stone wools, copper, silver, gold. All of these things were used at a different point in time in different cultures for money as a universal medium of exchange. But one thing started to happen over time where as society started to develop, the precious metals mentioned at the end, copper, silver, gold, they eventually became the preferred mechanism being a universal medium of exchange. In the last 5,000 years, what you've had happen is that gold pretty much won out. It became the main preferable store of value, medium of exchange. And the School of Austrian Economics says that there's 5 simple but core principles that money has to adhere to for it to become a universal medium of exchange. So I'm just going to mention all 5. Money, to be used as a universal medium of exchange, has to be divisible, durable, recognizable, portable, and it needs to be scarce. So one of the reasons why gold won out is because it best satisfied these 5 properties of money as defined by the Austrian School of Economics. So let's go through it with the lens of those 5 characteristics. One of the main reasons why gold won out above all of these other uses was mainly because gold was fairly divisible. Why is divisibility important? I'll state the obvious. You need less gold to pay for less and more gold to pay for more. Less gold for a coffee, more gold for a house. You need money to be divisible. Okay, you need money to be durable. If we decided to use oranges instead of gold, it wouldn't work very well because within about 2 or 3 months, oranges would rot and so would the value. Gold has stood the test of time. It can last for an enormously long time. It is therefore durable. Gold was recognizable. Although this is the first entrance into my talk that I want to pinpoint how greedy human beings are, because we are always looking around for something for nothing. So you'll see in multiple occasions throughout my talk today, you'll see how many people try to juke the system. So what they used to do in the old days is that they would take a copper coin and they would gold plate or overlay it with gold. And then they would give it to people, and the person would think they were getting a pure gold coin. But it turns out, if you've ever heard this term, if you do a little bit of dive into money, you'll hear these terms, sound money or hard money. It actually comes from the idea that they could eventually recognize the sound of a pure gold coin versus a copper coin overlaid with gold. If you dropped the coin from a certain height, it made a certain sound, and they became very good at recognizing that sound. But the main thing you need from money is that we both have to recognize its value. So if I'm like, here's the gold, and you're like, I want oranges, we've got a problem. So this is where gold won out. It was recognizable, we both agreed it was valuable, and I was able to tell, for the most part, the fake part versus the real part. You can imagine with shells, there are all these stories of how when the Europeans came to Africa, they found out that certain African states were using shell beads, beaded shells, should I say. And they had better technology, so they were able to replicate that with ease. So you need the money to be recognizable. Of course, you need the money to be portable. It needs to go wherever you're going. But by the way, that was one of the downsides to gold. It was portable, but now you stood with huge risk. If you were traveling with all your wealth at any point in time, you were at attack. You were at risk for attack. You with me? But last and most importantly, for something to be considered a universal medium of exchange, it needs to be scarce. It's important for things to be scarce because if there's too much of something, if too much of something floods the market, it no longer has its value. So this is where gold wins out, because it turns out, give or take, this is an estimate, you could take all of the world's gold and you could fit it into 2 Olympic-sized swimming pools. And it's basically impossible to replicate on a real scale. It's impossible to replicate right now authentic gold, because human beings haven't cracked alchemy. We required the Big Bang and the bunches of chemical reactions in the sky to deposit these gold deposits into the crust of the earth. And it even goes further than that. Although the gold is scarce, it's really expensive to drill out of the ground. It's time consuming. There is proof of work that requires to extract it from the ground. And even if we throw lots of resources at it, we can only extract an additional 2% per annum. So basically, gold has an inflation rate of about 2%. Money will always gravitate toward the lowest form of inflation. It always wants to run to a point where it's the most valuable later on. So you can understand why gold won out. Are you with me? But here's the one miss about gold, like I said. The portability thing was a mess. So what they started doing back in the day is someone came up with a novel idea. Human beings, invention, innovation. What we'll do is, we can't have you running around with your gold all the time. There's just too much security risk. Why don't we start a business where we'll build these massive warehouses and we will store your gold for you. But in lieu of storing your gold, we will give you these bond notes, printed pieces of paper that will say how much gold you have. And so instead of trading your gold bars, which is really hard to do, you can just trade these very authentic pieces of paper in lieu of gold. But when you trade it with someone else, they were guaranteed that they could come back to the warehouse and they could redeem it for gold. But of course, in this case, we entered third-party counter risk, because now we were relying on a third party to protect it. But it was still better than us carrying our own gold. And without getting too technical, that was really the birth of central banks. Central banks were places where the gold was kept in a central place. So here's the thing. Great idea and great system. But the thing about human beings are we're fucking greedy. We always want something for nothing. It's something that's built in us. So what is the thing that we do? Well, even these warehouses it wasn't uncommon for them to print more pieces of paper than there was gold in store. And at some point, if everybody cashed in their bond notes for the gold, there would be a discrepancy. So this was like a checks and balances system that we've always been having a fight with. But for the longest time, this is how fiat currency came about. The idea that today we use paper notes still, even though it's on its decline, paper notes, but we still use paper. But the idea was always that those pieces of paper, they were connected to gold. We called that the gold standard. You've heard of that? So money really connected to and there were times where we disconnected from the gold standard, but it always never ended well, and so we found a way to go back on. Ironically, some of the times that we disconnected of the gold standard was wartime. Because what these governments knew is that they couldn't afford to use all the gold store to fund the war. So they would disconnect the currency from the gold standard for a bit, print as much money as they like, really cheating the system, and then later they'd be forced to go back on. But some interesting things happened, right? There are 3 occasions where interesting things happened. In 1944, the war was finally done. America and the Allied powers had won the war. They had the majority of the gold reserves, and they created this idea at the Bretton Woods Conference. Without getting too technical, this is where the IMF was born. Quite simply, they said, gold and money will be connected to each other. But also, the US is as good as gold. So actually, the US became the global currency reserve, right, in the world. But in 1971, the world caught them out. Because what were the Americans doing? They were printing more bond notes than there was gold. Because people can't help themselves. We are greedy buggers. And when we can get something for nothing, we will take it. And when you give absolute power to someone for long enough, it corrupts them. You only have to live in this country, and you only have to live in others to see it. Absolute power does corrupt over time. It's not that everybody is bad all the time. There is truth to, there could be a government that could be good, but we can't rely on governments in succession to all be good, because when you least expect it, the next one will turn on you. We only have data and history to go on. But in 1971, America got called out. Countries from around the world started figuring out, these numbers don't seem to be adding up. We're going to go cash in our gold. And you know what the US told them? To hell with you. We ain't paying. And in that moment, President Nixon disconnected from the gold standard, and we've started a 50-year experiment ever since, where now money is connected to nothing. The word fiat, which is the currency we use, fiat currency means by decree, backed by government, backed by fuck all but a promise. Got it? So here's what I think is important for you to note. Why this is a problem is because the most developed nation on earth has a drug addiction. This is not subjective. This part is fact. You can take this all the way to the bank. Just kidding. What you'll see here is this is the debt level of the US. Okay, this graph tells you that the current debt level of the US is 27 trillion. But I saw just 3 days ago that the US, just in this time, just in the last year, is now an additional $3 trillion in debt. So they are $30 trillion in debt. You don't give a fuck because you can't possibly imagine how much money that is, because the human brain simply cannot work out what $30 trillion is. But let's go one further. What we at least had for a little while, just a little while, was that the debt levels were at least lower than the country's income for the year. That's the GDP ratio, right? That's what a country makes in a year. So at least the debt levels were lower than that, right? Right? America, hold my beer. We'll show you. The problem is that they're in a spiral right now, right? Because the debt, the national debt being $30 trillion, is more money than they make. And the interest on that debt is nuts. So you know what America's idea is? Let's print more money. This is not subjective, this part. Let me tell you the fact. America as a country has been around since the year 1776. Let me give you some perspective. Of all the dollars in circulation as of today, 40% of those dollars were printed in the last 18 months. You go Google it, you'll understand. This is not subjective. This is numbers corroborated by the Federal Reserve. If you don't think the US literally has a crack cocaine problem where they can't help themselves but print more money. And here's why it impacts all of you, because you look at everything I'm saying, you're like, yeah, but what does this have to do with me? Well, if you understand that money is only valuable when it's scarce and you just flood the market with money, you make it less scarce. So here's what happens. A year ago, the US says, we need to do this because of COVID, so they just print. Okay? Devalue the currency. We know automatically that as a result of flooding the market, you're going to have what's called inflation. It's that pesky little thing where the numbers of everything, the price of everything just goes up. The US said there would be no inflationary worries. They were used to like 2-3% max. They said, no, we'll just flood the market, but there'll be no problem. Then there was inflation. Then the US said, just kidding, because of course, there's nothing more permanent than a temporary government solution. The US then says, no, just kidding. Okay, there is inflation. So they change their tune. The markets react badly. They say, there is inflation, but it's transitory. It's just here for a little while, then it's gone. Then in November, they call a press conference. They're like, oh, sorry. Actually, the inflation is now 7%. It's here to stay, but we're shocked. Like Cyril. Cyril's always shocked. The US. How could this happen? How could we have inflation? Let's think. Why does that impact people like you and I? Well, two major reasons. The US is not the only country doing this. All countries around the world took their money off the gold standard. They are absolutely addicted to printing more money, and they are absolutely beholden to no one. So if you think I'm jabbering off, let me put it in perspective to you. When you were born, did you get to pick which currency you denominate in? It's not like you don't get to pick your name. You don't really go, I don't like the rand so much. It's just forced on you, right? You got to have a choice. Okay, at any point in time, have you ever managed to be able to vote for what the central bank does or how much money it prints? It's just done. But they don't actually have to feel the consequence of their actions. You and I do. And so systematically, inflation just keeps rising throughout the years, and it's like the frog boiling in the water. We're just like, yo, it's getting expensive, eh? But you know what? At least our incomes are going up. Bullshit. It's absolute bullshit. They're not. Not in ratio. So in the US, you have an inflation rate right now of 7%. This is what we call a normal day in South Africa. But in the US, this is like mad. But it's actually not true because of the way they measure inflation. And so my point is, some of those goods are actually 50% more expensive, 100% more expensive right now. They've got a catastrophic shitstorm on their hands. And they're pretending like it's not there, but the everyday American is feeling it. And their answer is, just print more money. And now they're like, oh, we must increase interest rates. So they're playing this game with citizens, which we don't get to opt out of.